Hi, I'm Kathy Daneman, and on behalf of Mystery Writers of America, welcome to the Symposium for the 78th Annual Edgar Awards. Tonight's discussion is with the nominees for Best Critical Biographical. Our moderator tonight is Judge Debra H. Goldstein, and our bookseller is Cherished Books in Atlanta. You can learn more about the Edgar Awards by following us on social media using hashtag Edgars2024 or by visiting the website mysterywriters.org and edgarawards.com. The Edgar Awards will be live streamed on our YouTube channel on May 1st. During tonight's discussion, I will be posting links to our panelists' books in the chat. Please feel free to submit questions in the Q&A box throughout the conversation, and we'll get to them at the end of the hour. Judge Debra H. Goldstein is the author of Kensington's Sarah Blair Mystery Series, 5 Bells Too Many, 4 Cuts Too Many, 3 Treats Too Many, 2 Bites Too Many, and 1 Taste Too Many, and 2 standalones, Maize in Blue and Should Have Played Poker. Her novels and short stories have been named Agatha, Anthony, Derringer, and Claymore finalist and received Silver Falchion, IPPY, AWC, and BWR awards. A national board member of Sisters in Crime, Debra previously was a national board member of Sisters in Crimes and Mystery Writers of America, and was president of the Guppy and Southeast MWA chapters. To learn more, visit DebraHGoldstein.com.
Thank you, Kathy. Good. Hi, I'm glad to see everybody today. I'm going to give you a quick overview of both of our authors and of their books. Very interesting books that are finalists this year. But sadly, finalist David Bordwell recently died. He was retired from the University of Wisconsin-Madison after a long career of teaching and writing. David authored or co-authored several books on Hollywood cinema, Hong Kong cinema, and the work of major directors. He was a finalist for the book this year, Perplexing Plots. Perplexing Plots argues that the tradition of mystery and detective fiction have provided models of form and style for mainstream popular storytelling. The book considers the works of Agatha Christie, Dorothy Sayers, Patricia Highsmith, Rex Stout, and many others. Perplexing Plots also holds that mystery fiction, often considered a down-market genre, is as worthy of critical study as prestige fiction. Max Allan Collins is an MWA Grand Master. He is the author of the Shamus-winning Nathan Hiller historical thrillers and the graphic novel Road to Perdition, which was the basis of the Academy Award-winning film. His innovative 70s series, Quarry, was revived by Hard Crime as Quarry's Climax, and it became a Cinemax TV series. Max has completed 13 Mickey Spillane novels and is the co-author with his wife, Barbara, of the Trash and Treasures mystery series, Antiques Foe. With James L. Traylor, he is the finalist for today's book, Spillane, King of Pulp Fiction. James L. Traylor is the co-author of this book, as well as 2 other Spillane-related books that he has written with Max Allan Collins. Those are One Lonely Night, Mickey Spillane's Mike Hammer, and Mickey Spillane on Screen. James's Dime Detective Companion is recognized for its contribution to pulp fiction research. He received his doctorate in English from Georgia State University, and he's specializing then in early realistic prose fiction. Their book, Spillane, King of Pulp Fiction, is best described as the first full-length biography of Mickey Spillane, an extremely popular and best-selling mystery writer in the World War II era. It covers how Spillane was highly influential in the beginning of the paper book back explosion of the 1950s. There were scores of imitators whose books also sold well, but nothing to compare to the millions that Spillane sold. Their book also addresses how Spillane helped to define the psyche of post-World War II America, both in terms of men and women, as well as how he was highly controversial because of his unabashed depiction of sex and violence. The former is tame by today's standards, the latter still potent, but both were groundbreaking at the time. Mark Dawidziak is the author or editor of 25 books, including 3 studies of landmark television series. The Columbo File, a casebook, The Night Stalker Companion, and Everything I Need to Know I Learned in the Twilight Zone, which is his lighthearted 2017 tribute to Rod Serling's classic anthology series. He also is an internationally recognized Mark Twain scholar, and 5 of his books are about the iconic American writer. His most recent book, today's finalist, is the biography, A Mystery of Mysteries, The Death and Life of Edgar Allan Poe. A Mystery of Mysteries, The Death and Life of Edgar Allan Poe examines Poe's much misunderstood life through the prism of his mysterious death. Mystery and horror. One of America's most iconic writers, Poe died under eerie circumstances that reflect the 2 literary genres he took to new heights. This biography uses a dual timeline narrative that alternates between Poe's increasingly desperate last months and his brief but impactful life. Along the way, it explores the many theories about Poe's death while knocking down the myths, misconceptions, misinformation, and mysteries that have obscured the real writer from our view. Robert Morgan is the author of several volumes of poetry. He has published 11 works of fiction, such as the New York Times bestseller Gath Creek and Chasing the North Star. Among his nonfiction works are the national bestseller, Boone, a biography, and today's finalist, Fallen Angel, The Life of Edgar Allan Poe. He is the recipient of awards from the Guggenheim Foundation and the American Academy of Arts and Letters. Robert is Kappa Alpha Professor of English Emeritus at Cornell University. In Fallen Angel, The Life of Edgar Allan Poe, Robert concentrated on connections between Poe's life and his poems and tales. Because Poe's life is almost as much as mystery as it's fiction, readers want to understand his life as a way of understanding Poe's stories. Similarly, many believe that knowing the stories themselves is the key to understanding Poe's mysterious and difficult life. Robert pays special attention to Poe's lifelong fascination with marriage and structures the biography around the important woman in Poe's life. Stephen Powell is an honorary fellow in the English department at the University of Liverpool, UK, and the leading authority on the life and works of James Ellroy. He is the editor of Conversations with James Ellroy and 100 American Crime Writers. He is the author of James Ellroy, Demon Dog of Crime Fiction. Today, he is a finalist for Love Me Fierce in Danger. He is the story of James Ellroy, one of the most provocative and singular figures in American literature. The self-styled demon dog of crime fiction, Ellroy enjoys a celebrity status and notoriety that few authors can match. However, traumas from the past have shadowed his literary and Hollywood success. The biography tells the epic story from tragedies such as the still unsolved murder of Ellroy's mother, Jean, to triumphs such as Ellroy's astonishing literary achievements. Congratulations to all of you for being finalists today. But you know something, as we were all reading these books, one of the things we all thought about was how you came to write them. David Bordwell, before his death, told me the following about perplexing plots. He said, "This project was a labor of love. As a mystery fan since my teenage years, I sometimes think that my admiration for the craft of making and solving puzzles steered me toward academic research. At any rate, I hope my admiration for that craft shines through. For the rest of you, how did you come to write the book for which today you are a finalist?"
Am I supposed to go now?
You can go, but you want me to call on you? Robert, go ahead.
Well, I had to memorize Poe's poems when I was in grammar school. We had to stand up and recite The Raven and Annabel Lee and To Helen. And I'll tell you, it was scarier to have to stand up in front of the class and recite a poem than it was reading Poe's stories. actually. I've always been interested in Poe, but I think the real motivation for writing this biography was I wanted to see if I could find the living person behind all the myths and legends, the masks, uh, the folklore about Poe. And I set out to read all the letters, to read the books on Poe, to read the work again, the stories, and I did find some things that I really didn't know. Uh, for instance, I did not realize he seemed obsessed about marriage, looking for the safe place, the sanctuary of marriage in a very troubled life. I was really surprised to discover that Poe loved to walk in woods and along streams, and he was as interested and took the pleasure in walking as much as Thoreau, I think. We don't think of Poe in that way. We think of him writing horror stories and Gothic stories. I discovered that he probably was so interested in the death of beautiful women because he had seen his mother die when he was very young, and he became very interested in the dead beautiful women. This obviously figures into his stories. I discovered that he was very interested in his mother's possible ethnicity. I had never heard anything about that. I discovered that he loved to write stories about the southern landscape. When he seemed to be writing about the north, he would put in the trees and vegetation of the South, around Charlottesville, for instance. I'm not sure I ever found entirely this living, breathing person, but I think I got closer than I had been before.
Sounds like you were fascinated by them. How about you, Stephen? What prompted you to write this book?
Well, I'd always been fascinated by Alroy's writing ever since I discovered him as a teenager. And over the past 20 years, I've been reading and writing about him academically. I'd written 3 academic books, but I'd felt a bit constrained by academic publishing in terms of its slightly more limited audience. And I began to think that maybe somebody could write James Ellroy's story other than himself because he'd written 2 memoirs. My experience was slightly more unique than perhaps other members of the panel in that Elroy being alive, I could cooperate with him on it. And I'd known him for several years. We'd see each other on and off. Then when I became his authorized biographer, when Bloomsbury gave me the contract, we became extremely close and spent a lot of time together and would talk for hours, and I would have to obviously fact check everything he would say, but I would bring him stuff about his life that he didn't know. For instance, he didn't know the identity of his mother's first husband. He knew of him only as the Spalding man, and he thought she had briefly married the heir to the Spalding sporting goods fortune. But through research, I was able to show him that it was actually she was briefly married to Easton Ewing Spalding, who was a real estate based in Los Angeles. And that was a key moment for me in terms of earning his trust and building the book from there. It was a delicate process in many ways because we both agreed that his rather active love life was important in his development as a writer and in his life story. So talking to his scores of ex-partners became imperative, and also talking to his many colleagues in publishing and Hollywood all became absolutely important, and getting all of their voices in. I was able to find out some key facts about the production of LA Confidential and hear a lot of insider Hollywood gossip, and show how that film came to be. It was no one at Warner Brothers really believed in it, but it turned into one of their classic movies, and I was able to show the development of Alroy's feelings about LA Confidential film, this Oscar-winning film, which was very good for him at first, but then he felt it was beginning to tarnish his legacy. So I was able to bring in a lot of original material when there was some concern that because Elroy was a great self-publicist and because he'd written these memoirs, that there'd be some sort of regurgitation, but that wasn't the case. I think, broadly speaking, his life is very fascinating. His mother was murdered, and this case is not solved. And he's been in jail. He's had addiction problems. He's had this kind of almost rags to riches success. It's almost like the American dream, but with extremely dark moments. So his story, his life lends itself very well to narrative. So I'm just glad I got there first.
Oh, thank you. Mark, I'm going to ask you the same question that I'll be asking everybody. And Max and James, you'll be next as to how you came to write the book for which today you are a finalist. Mark?
I wish I could take more credit than than I can for this one, but this one was really the idea of an editor at St. Martin's. And you only have to know me for a little while to know I really don't have a problem with ego. And you know, there's no lack of confidence when it comes to tackling big subjects. But I would not have put myself forward as the next person to write the biography of Edgar Allan Poe. I just didn't have that one in me. And I was having a discussion with an editor at St. Martin's about what the option book would be after the Twilight Zone book that I'd done for them. And so I hit this guy with my best slam dunk can't miss idea. And the only problem was it missed, and it missed badly. He did not like my slam dunk can't miss idea. And so he countered with an idea, and I didn't like his idea. So I gave him my second best idea, and he didn't like that either. And we were going back and forth like a tennis match, and we were just about to get off the phone. We were going to table the conversation for another day. And he said, "What about Edgar Allan Poe?" And I said, "What about him?" And he said, "Well, you know, I know this is one of the writers you've carried through your entire life, and it seems to be in your wheelhouse. It seems to check all your boxes. And you know, sometimes it just takes somebody else to point out the obvious in your life." And this was one of those moments because I didn't see it. And I said, "How? What do you mean?" And he said, "Well, you know, Poe is the father of the modern detective story. You've written a book about a landmark detective character with Columbo. Poe is the father of the modern horror story. You've written about major horror topics like The Night Stalker and Dracula and The Twilight Zone. And Poe is a critic his entire life. He was a professional critic. You were a critic most of your life. Poe is a major 19th century American author. You've written about a major 19th century author with Mark Twain. How does this not check all your boxes?" You know, and you know, I guess he's right. You know, this is something. But then it became an idea of what kind of book he wanted, and it became very clear that what he wanted was, and every panelist is going to nod up and down when I say this. He wanted the type of book that seems to arrive every 2 years and without fail, and we'll find another one coming right down the line that definitively claims to have solved the identity of Jack the Ripper. And this is the book he wanted to solve the murder, the death of Edgar Allan Poe. And as soon as he said that, I said, if that's the book you want, I want you to get up out of your chair, leave your office, go down into the street, and find yourself another lunatic because this one's running away right now. They said, "Let me tell you why that book can't be written," you know? And I enumerated no death certificate, no autopsy. And even if there had been an autopsy, it would have been worthless because in 1849, the state of the autopsy was primitive. It would have been done with the equivalent of machetes and butcher knives. And we don't enter the era of the modern autopsy until the Civil War, which is when we get very good at cutting up bodies. So there's no autopsy, no death certificate, no surviving soft tissue that can be subject to modern forensics, and most importantly of all, no reliable witnesses. You know, as Robert found out in his quest for Poe with his wonderful book, there's so much about Poe we don't know, which makes this journey so fascinating. But the one thing about Poe that always bothered me was that the stereotype that we've made of him, the caricature we've made of him, didn't add up. It was impossible that that guy was responsible for all of that writing, and not just the writing we know, but the writing most people don't know. So that's why I reversed the subtitle, and it became The Death and Life of Edgar Allan Poe, because with Poe, with most biographies, you always start in the logical place, which is where somebody's born. And with Poe, it always seems to be the opposite. We always seem to start with his death, because that's a fascinating, and with a good reason. It's the greatest literary stage exit in history. It's good reason we start there. So I reversed it only because of that, but also because I'm much more fascinated with the way Poe lived and how he died than that mystery. And that's as much a mystery than the death is. So
We're going to have some
that's what I
fun
got.
contrasting that in a few moments. Max, I already have given an introduction to you. Welcome again. And James.
It was great. It was a wonderful introduction.
Well, thank you so much. You had a wonderful, you have a wonderful bio to work with. But the two of you have written together. So I'm curious for how each of you came to write this book. I know you've written so many other Spillane books together and have written Spillane books, but this is the bio. So what prompted you, or should I say, how did you come to write the book for which today you are a finalist? And either of you can answer first, whichever you.
I'm only going to go back as far as junior high, so we won't do when I was born in a log cabin, okay?
Good.
But when I was in junior high, there was a craze for private eyes on TV. Some of you are old enough to remember that, Peter Gunn and 77 Sunset Strip and all of that. And I always had been someone who, if you saw a movie you liked or a historical subject was on TV or a movie, I would find the book and I would read the book. And so that craze on TV led me to Dashiell Hammett, Raymond Chandler and Mickey Spillane. And then I researched them as people because I would like to, I was aspiring to be a writer, and let's see how these writers developed themselves. And I was not surprised to see that Dashiell Hammett was fairly revered and that Raymond Chandler was much admired, but was astonished to find out that Mickey Spillane, who I liked on a level with the other two, and I was 12, so cut me some slack there. I was astonished by what I read about him, which was just vitriol, basically. And so I became, over the years, as I began writing myself, I became a kind of defender of Spillane's. I'd write articles for magazines, for Mystery Scene magazine type. I guess it was Armchair Detective was where I was writing in those years about him. And I would have arguments with people at conventions, and it went on. And then I finally decided somebody should write a book about this guy. And Jim Traylor contacted me, and I must have gotten out. I must have mentioned it somewhere that got in print. And Jim Traylor contacted me and said, well, I want to write a book about Mickey Spillane, so why don't we throw in together? And I thought that was a terrific idea. I also got to know Mickey around, I think it was 1981. I was asked to interview him. He had never done a fan convention before, and I was asked to interview him. So I interviewed him there and got to know him, and that opened the door for Jim and me to be able to go down to South Carolina, where Mickey lived at the time, and spend some time with him and interview him. And I think I'll pass the ball to Jim now, and he can talk about how he and I kind of had to conserve our energy to be able to deal with somebody as energetic as Mickey Spillane.
Thanks. Thanks, Max. Mickey could out-talk and out-stay up any three men, much less the two of us. He was a man's man. And to go back to when I first started thinking about Mickey, but about the same age as Max was. I was 13. I want to point out that you may find this somewhat interesting. The very first mystery story I ever read was Nancy Drew and the Hidden Staircase. And from that, I graduated to Perry Mason and Ellery Queen. And a little bit later on, as Max pointed out, Spillane entered the consciousness of the country about that time, about the time of the mysteries, and there was Mike Hammer syndicated TV show, 1958. And I bought my first Spillane book in 59, and I was captured by the emotional quality of it and how it just really pulled you in. Now, as far as meeting Max, he referred to an article that he did in the Armchair Detective, and I had a group of friends at the at Georgia State University where I was studying at the time, and they said, "Why don't you write something about Spillane?" And I said, "Well, I think I will." And I contacted Max very fortuitously because I found an address, having no idea where Max lived, of his co-writer and artist Terry Beatty had an address. I wrote to Terry Beatty, and Terry gave that letter to Max. And it turns out, very strangely and very amusingly, I was the name of one of the Dick Tracy characters, or the FBI man is named Jim Traylor, which I did not even know so at the time. But we both loved Spillane, and we both wanted to tell his story. And as Max alluded to, some of the vitriol and some of the things I first read, I spent a good deal of time defending Spillane to my friends too.
Well, thank you all. Let me go into this in a little more depth now. Robert and Mark, you both wrote books about Edgar Allan Poe, and in reading them, I found that your style and your tone were very different. You talked a little about how you were influenced by Poe and what you found, and you seem to have both taken it from different viewpoints. What were you trying to achieve or convey to the reader, and the special emphasis? Like Robert, you've talked about the woman in his life. Mark, you've talked about a few other things. So gentlemen, go at it.
Mark, I'll follow you.
All right. One thing is that when I set out to start my research on this, my research had been ongoing because up at that point, I have read tried throughout my, in my 20s, I set out to read everything that Poe had written. In my 30s, I set out to read everything that had been written about him, which, I still haven't done because there's been so much written about Poe. So I was a great admirer of the Poe biographies that were out there, and still am. I'm a great fan of them. So one of the things that made it very easy for me was I didn't want to set out to write the same kind of book that somebody had already written. So one of the things that was immediately taken off the table was writing a traditional biography. I was not going to do an A to Z through his life biography. And the other thing is everybody on this panel is going to agree with this. I mean, you can't pretend to be a kind of writer you're not. So when somebody says you're going to be writing a biography of Edgar Allan Poe, and you're not an academic writer, you can't sort of all of a sudden pretend to be an academic writer. You can't pretend to be a scholar. I was a journalist for 43 years. And the books I've written have been popular books. So this was going to be a popular biography, all along. And I was going to take the unorthodox step of interviewing for the book, which, that's not how you do a biography of somebody who died in 1849. There's nobody alive who knew Edgar Allan Poe. There's nobody alive who knew anybody who knew Edgar Allan Poe. So, but I set out to this as sort of like taking it as a detective on a case or a journalist, and you do interviews. You interview experts. I did a program with a Poe scholar in San Francisco last year. And she said, towards the end of the program, well, I thought it was a very brave thing of Mark to interview all of these leading Poe scholars and biographers for his book. And I said, I didn't think it was brave. I thought it was smart. These people have studied Poe throughout their entire life. They know minute aspects of Poe's life. They have studied in depth his work, his life, the geography of his life. How could you not draw on that? And in that, I had voices go throughout the book, which is, again, not the way traditionally you do a biography. So, some people don't like the book because it's unorthodox in some ways. I'll cop to that, sure. But I knew that I couldn't write in a style that was not my own. So I had to adopt a somewhat conversational tone because that's the way I write. And I knew I also was going to be, again, my witnesses. Who are my witnesses? My witnesses were forensic pathologists, forensic anthropologists, medical historians, those Poe scholars and biographers. All of these people, private eyes, an FBI agent. All of these people were my witnesses as I sort of probed the mysteries that were behind Poe's life and his death. And that's what another reason is, because Poe lived a very badly documented life, you know, compared to a lot of 19th century authors. If you set out to do a biography of them, there's an established trail, and there's a very good established trail on Poe, but that trail was not established on very good evidence. A lot of what we know about Poe, or let me say, think we know about Poe, is based on our best guess. I mean, there are years where we know very little about what Poe's doing. You get like the early 1830s when he's in Baltimore and he's living in Baltimore, and we practically have no record day to day of what he's doing. Is he working? Is he not working? How is he applying himself? So there's a great challenge to writing about Poe, and again, I think that one of the things that made it a little easier for me was just because I eliminated so many already established approaches to how you do it.
Well, thank you. Your dual timeline narrative is a contrast to yours, Robert. So tell us, Robert, the same question. What were you trying to achieve or convey to the reader?
Well, as I said before, I wanted to see if I could find the living person behind all these caricatures that have developed over the years, the mythologies, the legends, the kitsch. There's a lot of that about Poe. But I was very lucky to be in touch several times with Jerry Kennedy at LSU, who is one of those people who seems to know absolutely everything. And as Mark said about himself, I didn't feel that I was a Poe expert when I took on the project. I was fortunate that somebody invited me to do it, and I grabbed it. But the kinds of things that attracted me to writing about Poe were the contradictions about him. At times, he would write about science as something he loathed, as something he opposed, and at other times, he was really fascinated by science, which is the real Poe. Which is the, where's the genius? Is it with the code breaker, the person who knows everything about mathematics? One of the texts that really drew me into writing about Poe was the so-called prose poem Eureka. This strange, long piece of prose, 150 pages or so, that most biographers just loathe. I read it carefully. I was a science and math major in college. I had an interest in that kind of thing, and I discovered it was really a very interesting text, but it was much too long. If Poe had written it in 25 or 30 pages, it would be one of his masterpieces. But he does what he often does, is to write satire at the beginning instead of being serious about this theory of the cosmos. And I discovered that in that prose poem, particularly right at the end of it, he's on exactly the same page with the great transcendentalist Emerson, Thoreau, and Whitman that he claimed to dislike so much. But at that moment, he did exactly the same thing that they had done, the unity of the universe and the deity within yourself. He comes out on the same page that one time. That was fascinating, that all the great writers of that period were on the same page sometimes. Also, that his theory of the cosmos was very similar to modern theories of the Big Bang. And here's this man writing in 1848 who's envisioning a theory that we have now in 2024. So I decided that the big mistake he made was simply writing it too long. He took himself too seriously. He was an entertainer. He was not a philosopher. And at that point, he was in his manic phase, and Poe really was bipolar. There's little doubt of that. He got into this manic phase and decided he had solved the problem of the universe. And when he would go out to bars in Richmond and other places, he would get up on the table and declaim his theories He just simply went off the rails at that point. But he had a great idea, and it's not this loathsome thing that some people claim it is. There's an awful lot of imagination in it. That drew me to him. I love science, and I wanted to see really what he did and why he loathed it at times and why he loved it. I also wanted to understand what he was doing in those mysterious years, early 30s, when he became the great writer he became. In that it was not something finally that you could really know that much about. There are a few letters, mostly his fights with his foster father. He wanted money from this very stingy foster father, and he was courting some of the local girls, of course, and falling in love with his young cousin, whom he married at the age of 13. One of the great mysterious events of his life. How could this man, I think he was 26, marry somebody half his age? I decided that Poe was writing. You have mysterious years about Shakespeare. What was he doing? And what he was doing was mastering the art of the short story.
Well, you definitely have, imparted all that in your book. On a contrast, though, let me ask Stephen, Jim, and Max. Do you consider your books to be critiques or biographies of your subjects? Because you've written so many different versions of the particular individual you're writing about, Spillane and Elroy.
Could I take that for a moment?
You'll three of you get to take that one. Go ahead.
When Otto Penzler approached me about writing about Mickey in the early 80s, and that's when Jim and I decided to do a book together. And what we discovered when we got to know Mickey a little bit was that he didn't want a biography written of him. He said he would write his own autobiography, which he never did. And so we wrote basically a kind of a literary study of him. And Otto was not happy when we turned it in, because it didn't have Mickey's colorful life. And so it was published by Bowling Green, and that's a book we did, I think, in '84. And then a couple years ago, we did a book on the movies, all the movies and TV shows that had been done from his books, and contrasted them with the books themselves. But what we always knew we were going to do was a biography of Mickey, and we not to be crass here, but we had to wait till he wasn't here, because he wouldn't have cooperated with that. He did sit down with me for a documentary I did about him. I did a documentary called My Camera's Mickey Spillane, 1 hour, and he did sit down for 5 hours. I got 5 hours of material from him, which Jim and I used at great length, because we had a transcript of it. But the situation with Mickey Spillane is that you're not really writing, there are 3 or 4 books you could have written about him. And one is his, basically his pop cultural footprint, which is enormous. Him as a writer, a literary study of him, and then this crazy life of celebrity that he had, and then kind of how he mellowed in things he did in his later years. So when Otto came back to us all those years later about doing a biography, I had to tell him, look, with Mickey Spillane, this is not going to be, because he said, a literary biography. I said, well, it's a literary biography in the sense that he wrote books, he wrote novels, but he also was a pop culture figure. He also was somebody whose work sparked the paperback revolution. Gold medal books don't happen without Mickey Spillane. They literally formed to serve the market he had unveiled with the reprints of his early books. And then he moved into movies. He starred in 2 movies. He had that whole chain of commercials he did for Miller Lite beer and so on. So I had to tell Otto, okay, this is going to be in part a literary biography and a pop culture study, but it's also got to be kind of a show business biography, because it was very, very much a show business life. And then there was the problem that we had to address of that I became very close friends with him. And in a way, that can taint a book. And you have to be very, very careful about that if you're close friends with the subject. But I had access to things nobody else had access to. And I'd had experiences with him nobody else had had. How do we incorporate that into the book without it becoming a Valentine to him or my personal memoir? So what we came up with was little sections of the book, short ones, a page and a half or two, that would be in italics, which was a Mickey Spillane thing. He loved to use italics for emphasis. And I would do little autobiographical snippets of my encounters with him and things I had witnessed, some of which were very telling about his personality. Now, while I was doing some of that, Jim was off, and he'll talk to you about that, but he was off interviewing everybody who was still alive who had been cronies of Mickey's. And they were, I mean, Mickey died in his late 80s, and so publishers and editors, a lot of these people were gone. And so it took some real digging and resourcefulness on our part, and I really give Jim the nod on how hard he worked on that aspect of
Let's
the
hear
book.
that from Jim then. Okay. And if anybody has any questions, don't forget to get in the Q&A.
I wanted to, I was, what Stephen said a few minutes ago really hit me about, he had some personal experiences and we had some too, but I wanted to find out about the history. I'm basically a researcher. I've contacted some of his friends from the 40s and 50s when he had the little Bohemia up in Newburgh, New York, when he built his own house. One of those gentlemen was still alive, George Wilson. He was an artist. And even to this day, if you see some stationery from Spillane, you will see George Wilson's name there. This is a good story, and it's also a sad story. I made arrangements to go up to upstate New York where he lived, and I was on the phone with him, and I was taping the conversation with his permission. And we talked about an hour, and he was fairly old at the time and not in great health. The next day, or I was getting ready for the trip, and the day before the trip I was supposed to take, I got a phone call saying that he had died. So the only interview I had from George was what I had in those 90 minutes I talked to him on the phone, which covered most what I wanted to hear, but I wanted more detail. But it was sort of heart-wrenching that I had access to it, but I didn't get everything I really wanted. But that's the way I approached it. And I did the same thing with the book industry in Dutton and Signet archives in New York, and that they had donated to some of the best universities. And digging through those was like having access to everybody who worked with Spillane in the early publishing years. And that was fascinating.
From a research perspective, I can see how it would be. How about you, Stephen? Critique or biography or a little of everything?
Well, a little bit of everything, but having written monographs before, I didn't want to do a retread. I wanted to challenge myself and, tell this fascinating story. There were many kind of discoveries along the way. First of all, the volume of material I got made me decide to salami slice the chapters to make it easier to read, because the people I was reaching out to who knew Al Roy, they said to me, well, what took you so long? I knew this remarkable man 30 years ago, and I've kind of always been waiting to tell my story. And they would have absolutely incredible stories to tell. What Max said a few moments ago struck me about friendship and how that can be a two-way street was interesting. But I absolutely had that with James, because he never gave me any pressure, or he never tried to tilt the book in any certain way. It was clear that it was his life, but my biography of him. But he would ask me questions about other biographical controversies. He was very well versed in biography. He would ask me about Blake Bailey's biography of Philip Roth, what I thought about that, or Adam Sisman's bio of John le Carre. And we would talk around the subject without ever reaching a conclusion. And it was a little bit like a kind of tango we had going together. I what was the most revelatory to me was that James had these friendships with very seminal authors, and his friendships were a little bit like love affairs in terms of that there was a kind of heavy courtship where he would shower them with affection, and then he would rather dump them abruptly. And I knew that there was a danger here that the people who would have a bitterness towards him, and that the book, if it became too scathing, there would be a lack of sympathy between the reader and Alroy. But it was very interesting. In one case, I managed to effect a reunion between Alroy and a former friend. It was a slight reunion, but it happened, and that friend was Andrew Vax, the novelist and attorney. It's very difficult to land an interview with him because he had this elaborate security system in place. But finally, I did it, but he would only do it with Alroy's permission, and they hadn't spoken in 30 years. So I do know they spoke because of that they had this little mini reunion because of the book, and that was very satisfying. But when all is done and dusted and the book comes out, you look at it and you think, well, I've been fair to him as a man. I think, I've talked about his novels, his short stories, his Hollywood screenwriting career, the TV series is adapted, his journalism, and I've also told his remarkable life story. And you can only hope that you've got the balance right, hoping by the reviews or the readers' responses, you can say with a certain level of confidence that you have.
Stephen, when you talk about balance, that brings up a topic for all of you. When we look at this category, it's kind of a mesh category, critical, biographical, and you've all indicated you've done a little bit of both in some of your books. How would you compare, short answer, to writing a biography to writing a novel, writing mystery fiction to writing biography or critical writing? Or do you have a thought on that? Anybody?
Well, go ahead.
My experience, I'll go first very quickly, is that obviously you've got to keep the reader interested. You've got to follow kind of narrative lines, but your loyalty is also to the truth. So it's getting the balance absolutely right. And I'm very lucky that I had a fascinating subject, and I had an author who, despite being a great publicist, I learned that he was a publicist about certain areas of his life, and other areas he was extremely secretive about. So when I started this project and I said, well, anything I find out about you has the potential of going into the biography, because that's the nature of a life story, he agreed to that. Then there tended to be a lot of cliffhangers and things that kept turning the page, because they were the things that kept me going. Every time I spoke to someone and they said, you need to speak to this next person who will tell you the next chapter of the story or the next revelation, that kind of energy was pouring onto the page. It was kind of reflective of James's character, that your subject, their personality will come through in your story and will dictate the tone of your story to a degree. So that would be my 10 cents.
Okay, Robert, you were trying to say something.
Well, I think there are ways in which they're very similar, writing a novel and writing a biography. Each depends on surprise. A good novel has a living characters, and they become in control of the novel to some extent. Or if they don't surprise the author, they don't surprise the reader. In biography writing, you have the known facts. You certainly want to stick to the known facts, but the surprise comes from your insight often about those facts, what you do with them, what you see. Hopefully that's fresh to the reader. It's not what somebody else has already done. But I think in general, there are more similarities than differences between the two.
I'm a novelist primarily, and have done maybe half a dozen nonfiction books. In every case, I had a co-writer. And I always was the novelist side of the equation. And I would find someone like Jim, an historian, an academic to some degree. And I did the same thing. There were 2 books I did on Eliot Ness, on the life of Eliot Ness. And that was done with a guy named Brad Schwartz, who was a, very distinguished young historian. And I think part of my job was the novelist job to keep it linear. Very tricky with Spillane because he easily falls into categories where you could talk about this part of what he did, and this part of what he did, and this part of what he did. But the reader likes a linear trip. At least that's my experience. We were lucky in that we had a central mystery, and that mystery was at the peak of Spillane's career. At the peak of his career, which would be the early 1950s, he had written 7 novels. And for about 20 years, 25 years, those 7 novels were 7 of the 10 best-selling novels of all time. And he was once asked by a critic once said to him, well, it's just disgraceful that your work would be that you have 7 of the top 10 best-selling novels of all time. And he said, "I shut up, I'll write 3 more." But that's the question. That's the mystery. He didn't write novels for almost 10 years. This would be like Stephen King writing The Shining and then taking 10 years off. It's not a really smart marketing move. And he paid for that. His reputation paid for that. But he came back in the 60s and wrote up into the 1970s. But we found out, and we've been wondering for years, we actually solved the mystery, which had to do with his unhappiness. And this, Stephen made me think of this, his unhappiness with Hollywood. And he had a deal with a producer who would essentially have an open-ended option on any My Camera book that he wrote for 10 years. That figure pops back up, doesn't it? 10 years. As soon as that contract was up and wasn't renewed, a year later, there's a My Camera TV show with Darren McGavin. Year after that, Mickey starts writing novels again, including My Camera novels. And that was like, well, we have co-authors here. That was the thing on the shelf that had been there exposed the whole time through the whole story. It'd been right in front of us the whole time, and we hadn't noticed it, but we found it.
Hey, either of you 2 have something short to add before we have to wrap this up?
Yeah, I'll just say very short, because one of the things I've been fascinated with, and when I write about Rod Serling or Mark Twain or Edgar Allan Poe, I'm fascinated by the creative process, and it's sort of what you asked about. And every writer is different. Every writer is built different. And the only thing I'll add to everything everybody just said was that for me personally, one thing that I have found is whatever I do on a fiction side or a journalistic side or a biography or whatever, it helps whatever else I'm writing. It makes me a better writer in whatever else I do. Some ways I can't wait to get back to something else once I've done it, because you get insights and learn how to do things by some people are and again, everybody's built differently that way. But, and that's just for me personally. I've always learned that whatever I've done on the fiction side of things has helped me be a better nonfiction writer.
Jim, anything last thoughts?
One last thing is Max described perfectly our collaboration, and I was extremely impressed how he took some of my stuff. I didn't quite know how to make it work for the reader and made it extremely readable and enjoyable for the audience we were trying to get to.
Well, you all did an excellent job. Having had the opportunity to read your books, I want to congratulate all 5 of you on being finalists, as well as the late David Bordwell. As we wrap up tonight, which I can't believe the hour has already sped by us, I want to remind people to join us this Sunday afternoon at 1 p.m. for a conversation with the nominees for Best Juvenile, which will be hosted by Books of Wonder on Crowdcast. You can learn more about the Edgar Awards by following us on social media using the Edgar's 2024 hashtag, or by visiting the websites http://mysterywriters.org and edgarawards.com. Again, everybody, thank you so much for being with us tonight, and good luck to all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you,